Hi, welcome. My name is Holly. Every month I do a digital discussion on behalf of Edison Ford Winter States, focusing on a topic in history. And this month I'm focusing on Christmas and the holidays during World War II. And I'm going to try to move myself out of the way here a little bit so you can see the tree behind me and the soldiers celebrating Christmas. There. Christmas and the holidays during World War II. And I do focus mainly on Christmas, mostly because that's what I could find the most information on. And this focuses on US citizens. I could have done a whole lot more. It's a broad topic. And here we have the Roosevelt family. In December 1941, anxiety about Japanese air raids has caused the relocation of the New Year's Day Rose Bowl from Pasadena, California, which is where people traditionally think it takes place, to Durham, North Carolina, where Duke would play Oregon State. However, shops were still decked out with goods, and the Rockettes were still at Radio City Music Hall, and there was a lot of food in store windows. And against that backdrop, Winston Churchill crosses the Atlantic on the new battleship, the Duke of York, amid strong winds for a late December meeting with President Roosevelt. So he's going to be away from home for Christmas. The American military worried about having the prime minister at the president's elbow, where he could use his persuasiveness to sway the president. His visit was kept a secret from almost everyone. Obviously, he is not included in this family picture. There's Franklin, there's Eleanor, the children and grandchildren, and probably Franklin's mother. At 4:30 on Christmas Eve, 1941. Now remember, just 2 days ago, in our time, Pearl Harbor had been bombed. It was on December 7th, 1941. And that's another topic of discussion for another day. So that's the backdrop here. We are entering war. At 4:30 on Christmas Eve, the Marine Band on the White House lawn struck up Joy to the World, and accompanying choirs from area churches there sang as well, and thousands had gathered as it became dark. And I try to word this the correct way. This wars are horrible, and there's no two ways about it. But it was a war that seemed like everyone was behind, as much as you can be behind war. But there were such horrific things happening in the world. So it's considered by many to be the last war that really united people. If that makes sense to you, the President and Mrs. Roosevelt gathered on the South Portico with a group of guests. It was then Churchill's arrival in the United States became news. So now people know he's there. Can you imagine he had to come over on a battle ship? Roosevelt pressed a button to light the national Christmas tree, which was interesting to me, even though there were wartime blackouts everywhere else. It didn't seem to pertain to the tree lighting that wasn't blacked out. And the British and Americans worked through Christmas on joint planning, breaking in the afternoon for holiday dinner. And there's on the left Churchill and on the right Roosevelt. As the war continued, each holiday season brought more restrictions and rationing. The British Prime Minister did not return to London until January 17th. So think about almost a month he was there. And this wartime visit to confer with President Roosevelt established Churchill's special relationship with the White House. And I'm sure all kinds of people have opinions on the relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill, as one is having opinions on them. But this is really, my focus is just on Christmas during this time, during World War II. And that's courtesy of the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, which if you've never visited, it's certainly worth a visit. In the fall of 1941, a group of well-known people from Calais, you'd say Calais in French, but I believe Calais, Maine is how it's pronounced, including historian Ned Lamb and businessman John Trimble and Arthur Umbosky, wrote to the president offering the White House a Christmas tree from St. Croix Island, 8 miles south of Calais, for Christmas. And they offered it to the White House on November 28th, 1941. We should be very happy indeed to have the Christmas tree from the island near Calais, Maine. It would be like something from home. As you know, I have a 50-year familiarity with the every inch of St. Croix River up to and beyond Calais. And that was from the president. But that reply wasn't received till early December. And the Calais folks had to hasten to obtain the tree. And 2 days after Pearl Harbor, they managed to get to the island, and John Trimble cut the tree. And the keeper and his wife and Elson and Constance Small were reluctant. That's who they are. They were the keepers of the island. They were reluctant to take a tree from an island with such few small trees. And I always think of that when people donate trees for the White House, how much they're sacrificing. Finally, they were convinced that the sacrifice was appropriate given what had happened on December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor. And you can see part of the tree laying down here. Constance Small, the keeper's wife, described the day the tree was cut down, 2 days after Pearl Harbor. One day in 1941, on December 9th exactly, a signal was seen at Red Beach for Elson to pick up guests on shore. There he found a Mr. John Trimble, Mr. Arthur Unobsky, two businessmen from Calais, and a photographer from the State Publicity Bureau in Augusta. Pearl Harbor had just been attacked starting World War II, and it had been decided to send a Christmas tree from the site of the first Christmas celebrated in North America to the White House. And I think that's because of the time the sun rises, perhaps. White House, where President Roosevelt was entertaining Mr. Winston Churchill for Christmas. A beautifully shaped tree. It was about 18 feet high and one of the few left on the island that was chosen. If it hadn't been for a historical purpose, I would have felt quite bad to have it cut down. Me too. Less than 3 weeks after the December 17th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans celebrated their first Christmas during World War II. At first, it didn't look that much different because we had just gotten into the war. And the majority of men and women who are serving, they're not yet overseas. But fear and uncertainty came with the United States entering the World War. I mean, there had already been one. They never thought there would be a second one. And some people believe it's a continuation of the first. As the war kept on, U.S. men and women were shipped overseas, and at home, food rationing, something that we haven't faced in recent years, though there's certainly food deserts and people in need of food. As far as our country being in a war, no. Everyone was in survival mode, and people had to make do, and especially, not being sexist, but women, because they were now the heads of the household in a society where women typically had defined roles, where they were not the leader of the household during that time. They were asked to contribute to the war effort by taking on roles in factories and other places reserved for men. And I don't want you to think I'm being sexist. It just was a different world with different roles for women at that time. World War II is going to help change that. During World War II, Christmas trees were in short supply because of lack of a manpower to cut the trees down and a shortage of railroad space to ship the trees. That would be considered frivolous, I'm sure, to be sold. So Americans rushed to buy America-made Visca artificial trees, and that's one of them there. And some of them even look a little more wonky than this. In 1941, a 5-foot Christmas tree could be purchased for 75 cents. The shortage of materials like aluminum that was used to make ornaments led many people to make their own ornaments at home. The shortage of material, electric bubble lights were created during the 1940s and remain popular today. And many Americans threw away their German-blown glass ornaments and Japanese ornaments in the trash when the war began. Shortly after the war began, Corning Glass Company in New York began mass producing Christmas tree balls using machines designed to produce light bulbs. So they were making bulbs. Corning Glass, Edison had some Corning Glass in his laboratory, by the way. Corning could make more ornaments in a single minute than a German glass blower could make in a whole day, which I understand, but those were a little more precious and a little more unique at the time, but not during the war. They were not going to support that, nor could they. And to give people to give their trees, if they didn't have one of these Visca trees, they could have a snow-covered effect. People mixed a box of Lux soap. I don't know if you remember what that looks like. And it's kind of flaky, with 2 cups of water, and brushed it on the branches of their tree. And Christmas in 1941, this song, White Christmas, was broadcast around the world. It wasn't yet recorded. It's kind of a time where things are melancholy and people are longing for home. And they had an underlying feeling of melancholy for both the American soldiers and those at home with empty places at the dinner table. Some of the most serious holiday songs were recorded during this time, including White Christmas 1942, and that became one of the most popular songs of all time. I'll Be Home for Christmas, 1943, and Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, which I think is from the movie Meet Me in St. Louis, but we all know Bing Crosby and White Christmas. Franklin Roosevelt spent 10 consecutive Christmases at the White House. Remember, he's the only president to serve a third term, and he had been elected for a fourth term when he had passed away. We don't have that anymore. 2 terms is it. And he spent the last 2 at the Roosevelt home in Hyde Park. A White House Roosevelt Christmas included a Christmas Eve party held by the president and the first lady for White House staff and the lighting of the national Christmas tree. And I don't have this in here, but I know that after those war years, the White House took quite a beating. They weren't doing a lot of repairs, so a lot of work needed to be done. Eventually, they had to work on it and close it when Truman was president, and he had to move next door to the Blair House. During the war years, they lit National Christmas tree. They had the party, and Christmas traditions changed during the war years. During the White House Christmas gathering in 1942, employees were given a black leather folder filled with war savings bonds. You're going to see a lot of those. To support the war effort, they sold savings bonds. In 1944, a scroll with the president's D-Day prayer was handed out to employees. Roosevelt's last Christmas message was delivered from his home in Hyde Park, New York in 1944. We pray that with victory will come a new day of peace on earth in which all the nations of the earth will join together for all time. That is the spirit of Christmas, the holy day. May that spirit live and grow throughout the world and all the years to come, he said, according to the White House Association. People were in survival mode during the war. While husbands were gone, women took care of their children, they worked, and they kept things going. And that led to some of the firsts for the country as it entered the holidays. Women took on the role of Santa for some department store celebrations. And in 1943, Bloomstein's department store in Harlem became the first U.S. retailer to hire a black Santa. And blackouts and blackout drills, you couldn't let light show, meant outdoor holiday light displays weren't feasible, even though that tree was certainly lighted that first year, while indoor Christmas trees went either unlit or covered as windows were blackout, so light didn't escape outside because they were worried about us becoming attacked. And to see here's a family in celebration. Holidays became more about sacrifice, and people scrimped and saved on everything that you could imagine. They didn't waste things. They ate things that even weren't so desirable. I think they used to have to put orange tablets into their fake butter, oleo, margarine to color it. And people purchased war bonds for loved ones instead of traditional gifts, and homemade gifts were popular. Knitting and crocheting were ways to make presents. Painting and other crafts gained popularity, with rationing making it difficult to find manufactured gifts. We have not been required to do those kind of things in recent memory. And children's toys also were difficult to find during the war years, and they changed with metal and other materials used to make them. Toys were kept for war use. Toys were made out of paper, cardboard, and wood. And popular toys during the war included dolls, wooden jeeps, and planes, and Build-A-Set, cardboard sets that often had a military theme. And holiday dinners changed as well. Many families sacrificed turkey dinners, if they could even find a turkey, so that troops overseas could have them. And many families opted for smaller birds like chicken or ducks and got creative with side dishes and desserts made with ration supplies. There was definitely a shortage of sugar during the war, and butter among the first foods to be rationed. And desserts like victory cake, yum, and gelatin-based desserts gained popularity, while side dishes would be made from whatever food supplies were on hand. And victory cakes were like they could have been made like from raisins that had been soaked. They really had to be creative, and it didn't necessarily taste the same way as the other, but people were willing to make this sacrifice because of the war. And this is Westminster Abbey, and this is from their site. And this is a place where a lot of US troops were at on and off in Great Britain. And it was frequently bombed. And you can see on the left here, though it didn't hurt anyone inside because of that location. And a similar photo to today in recent years, what it would look like. And when America entered World War II in late 1941, holiday celebrations were more somber due to Pearl Harbor, but most servicemen and women were still home that year. In November 1942, England opened the doors of Westminster Abbey for a Thanksgiving service, and about 3,500 soldiers filled the room for the unparalleled gesture, with the Star Spangled Banner being performed, as well as America the Beautiful. A feast soon followed at a local Air Force station that was attended by local school children. And another thing that tied people to home during the holiday time was this mail, especially at Christmas and Hanukkah and other holidays. Most Americans serving overseas during World War II appreciated the mail that they received from their loved ones, especially during the holidays. The U.S. Army and Navy Postal Services collected gifts, cards, and other mail in September and October to ensure delivery by Christmas. Packages sent to relatives and friends serving in the military often included cards, clothing, photos. The U.S. Master General reported in 1942 that communication with their loved ones strengthens fortitude and enlivens patriotism and makes loneliness endurable. The sentiment was also reflected in the motto of the 6,887th Central Postal Battalion. No mail, low morale. Nicknamed the 6888, the battalion was the only all-black unit of the Women's Army Corps, WAC, to be deployed overseas during World War II, and was responsible for, they were women that flew, by the way, but they would have been in the U.S. Helping to train. It was responsible for millions of pieces of mail getting to the hands of the U.S. soldiers, these Black women, as well throughout the year. And that was from the history.com. And I have not seen this, but I am aware that last year this movie came out called The 6888. And I also think there's a book. It's an American war drama written and directed by Tyler Perry, based on the 6,887th Central Postal Battalion, an all-female Black battalion in World War II. Oh, it's based on an article, Fighting on a Two-War Front. So there's a movie about them starring Kerry Washington. It's on Netflix, and it tells their story and how important the mail was to get delivered. And this tells you how to send Christmas gifts overseas. Nothing was more important than gifts from home. The Army and Fleet Air post offices did their best to deliver packages quickly, but the volume of the mail and the long distance it had to travel made it difficult. Families were advised to mail between September and October. That's an awfully long time. The Navy restricted packages to under 5 pounds. Sadly, many servicemen, especially sailors at sea, received packages months late, and some of them they couldn't even eat. Many gifts were cherished and useful, like candy, cookies, and a variety of foods and warm socks. Some were unique, like neckties. What are you gonna do when fighting a war? And cologne. There are also packages with cigars or cigarettes, coffee, socks, soap, and other necessities. Some families dressed up the gifts by wrapping them in festive paper or homemade decorations. Journalist Margaret Burke White, and she was a pretty big deal, and people listened to what she said. And she was a reporter that was on the front lines, created a guide for families, helped them decide what to send. She suggested family photographs, books, especially fiction, magazines, and candies, like fine chocolate or peanut brittle that were not readily available. Here is a story of some Japanese citizens. Yes, we are at war with Japan, but Star Trek actor George Takei, I'm saying that wrong, was 5 years old when his family was incarcerated in a prison camp in 1942. Despite his parents' reassurance that Santa would still pay him a visit, he was concerned that Santa wouldn't be able to make it through a barbed wire fence, he said in an interview in 2012. But his parents were right. A Japanese American Santa came bearing gifts. I think this is a forgotten story, though it's gotten more publicity in recent years. Between 1942 and 1945, about 125,000 Japanese Americans, they were Americans, mind you, were incarcerated by the United States government into prison camps. And that was done with the approval of the Roosevelt administration. Half for children. Maintaining holiday traditions was one way that people tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in their lives. For Japanese Americans, decorate the mess halls with scrap material, designed their own cards, and went caroling through the barracks. I'm sure everybody has an opinion on this, but whether or not U.S. citizens should ever be in a prison camp. And they were also, not as well known, that was also done with some German Americans as well. I like this picture a lot. During December of 1943 and 1944, millions of servicemen spent Christmas away from their home. Some did in 1941 and more in 42, but these were the most difficult times when the most people were gone. And it's Christmas Day, you can imagine, was very difficult for the soldiers and sailors and airmen stationed thousands of miles from home. And these guys, remember I told you they were having turkey, but these guys managed to capture some chicken. In 1943, over 500,000 soldiers celebrated the holidays in England. On Christmas Day, Captain George Knabb of the 115th Infantry Regiment wrote home to his wife and son, "It doesn't seem like Christmas in the least. We do have the day off, and we had an excellent turkey dinner." And food was one of the greatest comforts to soldiers, regardless of their posting. As a result, the U.S. military supplied turkey dinners to almost all soldiers wherever they were stationed on Christmas. Those in combat appreciated the meal. All of them, including George, were praying they would not be there next year, but it was not to be. They were there. Oh, and here's a very difficult time. On Christmas of 1944, there's been below freezing temperatures and heavy snows across northern Europe. On December 26, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel James Polk wrote to his wife and Josephine about how he spent Christmas in command of the 3rd Cavalry Group on the Franco-German border. "My adorable wife," Polk began, "I spent most of Christmas Day inspecting the frontline troops, and they did amazingly well. The adaptability of the American soldier is never-ending source of amazement to me." Polk observed the soldiers bringing a little touch of home to the front lines. There are many Christmas trees in the river town billets, and even in the gun positions, all decorated in great style. The German ornaments are the same as ours, and we looted a lot of them. Sentries and patrols and gun crews were rotated, so everyone got turkey, and some even had baked cakes and pies in their little rear area. When Polk returned to his headquarters after visiting his men, they sang a few Christmas carols and wished that they were home. Despite his homesickness, Polk recognized that he was fortunate. Just 30 miles to the north, one of the largest, most horrible land battles in U.S. Army history, the Battle of the Bulge, was being fought in the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. And this is from the National World War II Museum. Officers of the 101st Airborne Division have a Christmas dinner in Bastogne, Belgium, while the city was under German siege. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, fourth from the left, was in command of the division during the siege. And this is December 25th, 1944. And this Belgian family is introduced to the custom of toasting marshmallows. And there was a corporal. A lot of people visited local families. Corporal Wally Branson of Chicago is their guest on Christmas Eve, and this is also in Belgium. And though there were enemy shells shrieking overhead, Christmas carols are sung by the members of the 101st Airborne Division. There's quite a bit about that Christmas and what was happening there. And if you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to look up what happened there at the Battle of the Bulge and how difficult, how hellacious it was. But the spirit of the soldiers is something that amazes me. And here's some American infantrymen with the 290th Infantry Regiment during the Battle of the Bulge. And you can see all the snow there. And this is a picture of some bomb damage in that area, the result of a German 10-day siege. German artillery and aircraft reduced much of Bastogne to ruins where the Americans refused to surrender. The Luftwaffe, the Germans, launched a 4-night bombing mission against the military and civilian inhabitants. And Christmas was taking place. The 17th Airborne Division arrived just before Christmas. Their first action was west of Bastogne, and the troopers cleared the area of German units. The Battle of the Bulge was costly for the airborne. The 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion had only 55 men left and was inactivated. Did you hear that? 55 men. The 551st Parachute Infantry Division had 100 men left and also was inactivated. The men of both battalions transferred to the units of the 82nd Airborne. And that shows the site that I got some of that information from. And I did want to talk about, because not everybody celebrates Christmas. There were Jewish soldiers, and this was something that was on the cover of the Southern Jewish Weekly, The Light of Courage, and that's a menorah. And one of the stories talks about people celebrating Hanukkah. The air hung heavy and thick with smoke on the blood-soaked island of Saipan. The thermometer had clawed past 100 degrees as the sun sank. This is during December. On the Pacific horizon on December 10th, 1944, the battle's fury had mostly quieted. Yes, but they were still a burst of gunfire. It appears one Marine is relieving another on the beach at Saipan. They crawled. I didn't put that picture in, but they were relieving each other from one position to another to avoid getting hit. And on this island where life and death still wrestled, a group of men gathered for something entirely different. They were U.S. Marines and soldiers exhausted from months of combat. But in that moment, they came together, not for another assault, but to mark a sacred tradition. Against the backdrop of ruin, they prepared to celebrate Hanukkah, the festival of light that the Jewish people celebrate, a fragile flame of faith flickering in the heat of war. And the heat was so bad that the candles of the menorah would burn. And on a nearby tarmac, there was B-29 Superfortress bombers already coming to life, forming their engines for a mission over Tokyo, a deadly one for some. And another story is that in France, a Jewish GI was seeking a moment of peace. He was Sergeant Sheldon Cohen of the 556th Military Police Escort Guard. And he was at the Stenay detention camp in France, guarding German prisoners of war, having previously supervised POWs in Texas. Now he was on the cusp of an Allied push into Germany, and he found strength in lighting his menorah. But on the evening of December 15th, after lighting the sixth candle, the flame of peace was violently extinguished. The very next day, the German military began the surprise offensive. The Battle of Bulge had begun, and the Ardennes region was instantly transferred into a nightmare, the costliest battle in U.S. war history. and that's how they were celebrating, if you can call that a celebration. But what amazes me is how that they found a way to still spread light and hope in such horrible circumstances. And one last thing before I talk about this story is that it was a war where Americans were willing to make sacrifices. Um, and as even during the holiday times, because they wanted to do it for the people who were serving. This is a story. I'm trying to find the best. I tried to find the best version of it and the most accurate. It's called Christmas Miracle in the Ardennes. So I was just talking about that battle and how awful it was. There's no a formal peace treaty. There were some minor moments, but during World War I, I think I shared with you a couple of years ago, there was a moment, everyone had that moment of peace on Christmas Eve. Did not happen in World War II. But on Christmas Eve, 1944, there was heavy snow in the Hürtgen forest in Germany near the Belgian border. Inside a tiny cabin in the woods, 12-year-old Fritz Winken and his mother Elizabeth listened to the warplanes and artillery shells as the Battle of the Bulge near its climax. As they tried to make the most of the holiday, they couldn't anticipate that a Christmas miracle would come to their home, and it was a very modest and simple home. Months earlier, the mother and son had moved to the isolated cottage where their home in nearby Aachen had been destroyed by the Allied bombing. For Fritz, excuse me, at first shared his story in 1973 for the Reader's Digest, and I remember reading this when I was a teenager. The remote cabin offered a reprieve from the death and destruction of World War II. His father, who baked bread for the German army, had been recently called into service as the Allied armies, which we were part of, pressed closer to Germany. And they did not hold much hope that Hubert would be able to join them for Christmas Eve dinner. Less than 2 weeks earlier, the tranquility of the Hürtgen forest had been shattered when Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had unleashed 30 divisions hidden in the nearby Ardennes forest of Belgium for the last major German offensive of World War II, and fighting had erupted across the Western Front, including around their cabin, as Allied armies desperately tried to repel the surprise attack amid a blizzard conditions. And there's Fritz as a young lad there. Part of a U.S. Army convoy to the front line stopped nearby, but never came to the cabin. But as one night they are preparing their Christmas Eve dinner, so it is Christmas Eve, and they were startled by a knock on the door. I mean, they're in an isolated place in the forest, though war had come virtually to their front doorstep, and the closest neighbors were miles away. So with Fritz by her side, Elizabeth opened the door and saw 3 young soldiers, all armed. 2 were standing, and the third lay in the snow with grievous wounds. The men spoke a language unknown to the Winkens, and Fritz realized they were Americans. And he said, "I'm almost paralyzed with fear. Though I was a child, I knew that the harsh law of war, anyone giving aid and comfort to the enemy would be shot. So that means if they help these Americans, they will be shot." But Elizabeth also knew the penalty for harboring Americans, but the soldier bleeding in the snow was young enough to be her son. I believe one of them was 16. She motioned for all 3 to enter the cabin, and Fritz and his mother helped the severely injured man into a bed and tended to his wounds. None of the Americans spoke German, but Elizabeth and one of the men communicated in French. And Elizabeth wanted to stretch their meager meal to accommodate the guest, told Fritz, "Go get Herman." Who's Herman? Herman was a rooster being fattened when the father, her husband, Hubert, made it home for dinner. He was named for Hermann Göring, a Nazi leader who Elizabeth did not think highly of at all. While this is all happening, there's another knock on the door. Fritz opened it and expected to see more Americans lost in the forest. But instead, he was alarmed to find 4 German soldiers. These young men had become separated from their unit and were looking for shelter from the cold. Elizabeth goes outside to speak with them and telling them they were welcome to spend the night, but they had to leave their weapons outside. Now, Elizabeth is taking quite a risk here. When the young corporal started to object, Elizabeth looked at him sternly and said, "It is the holy night, and there will be no shooting here." While the Germans placed their weapons next to the woodpile, Elizabeth went back to the cabin and returned with the Americans' guns. When they were all gathered inside, the enemies stared at each other in stony silence, wondering how this temporary truce would last. How long would it be maintained? She took command of the scene, Fritz wrote in the Reader's Digest, and said, had the combatants mingle close together. She realized that a meal of Herman wasn't going to satisfy such a large group, so she told her son to get additional ingredients for the chicken soup she was preparing, and to get more potato and some oats. He remembers her saying, "And a starving man is an angry one." When the wounded American started moaning, one of the Wehrmacht soldiers examined him, and I apologize for any mispronunciations I have made. He had been a medical student before the war and realized that the man had lost a lot of blood, and he said what he needs is rest and nourishment, said the German soldier. Eventually, everyone began to relax, and both groups of soldiers searched their backpacks for food to share. The Wehrmacht corporal contributed a bottle of red wine and a loaf of rye bread, and soon the soup was served, and Elizabeth bowed her head and said grace. And young Fritz noticed his mother's eyes were filled with tears. I noticed that some of the soldiers wept too, perhaps thinking of their families far away and the hell they'd all been through. And perhaps they were feeling grateful they didn't have to fight on Christmas Eve. The next morning, the soldiers prepared to go back to war. A stretcher was crafted from a pair of poles and Elizabeth's tablecloth to transport the wounded American. And so his fellow soldiers would be carrying him as the U.S. soldiers checked a map. The German corporal showed them how to get back to their own lines. Then they shook hands and headed off in the opposite direction. "Be careful, boys," Elizabeth called after them. "I want you all to get home someday where you belong. God bless you all." Not long after the war ended. So right there, we have a miracle. We have peace taking place. We have people meeting up that should hate each other on Christmas Eve. Not long after, they were reunited, Fritz and his mother and father. And Fritz comes to the United States in 1959, opened a bakery in Honolulu. Hubert died in 1963 and Elizabeth in 1966. And Fritz had always hoped to meet the soldiers again, though he knew his chances of seeing the Germans were not good. They had an incredible, staggering fatality casualty rate at the end of the war. He thought publicity might help. And so, starting with his 1973 Reader's Digest article, and President Reagan mentioned it in a speech in 1986, and he appeared in 1995. Fritz did on the show Unsolved Mysteries and told his story. Now, Elizabeth didn't exactly remember their names correctly, but they're still going to uncover him, even though her memory was a little different as time passes. A nursing home chaplain in Frederick, Maryland saw the episode and remembered a resident telling a similar story. He contacted the producers about Ralph Blank, and the name that Elizabeth remembered was slightly different. But he was a World War II veteran who had been a sergeant with the 8th Infantry in 1944. And guess what? Ralph Blank was one of those soldiers. He had told his story many times. Nobody perhaps always took it seriously. In 1996, Fritz flew to Maryland to meet with Blank, who was 76 and in poor health. They recognized each other immediately and reminisced about their shared evening of peace during the hellacious war. Reunion was filmed and shown on Unsolved Mysteries later that year. And at one point during the episode, Ralph turned to Fritz and said, "Your mother saved my life." You know which soldier he is, correct? He is the one that was wounded, and he was quite young. The former German boy who is now an American citizen, that moment was the high point of his life. "Now I can die in peace," he had told the Honolulu Star. "My mother's courage won't be forgotten, and it shows what goodwill will do." Neither man lived to receive the retelling of the 2002 TV movie Silent Night, a retelling of their story. Ralph died in 1999 at the age of 79, and Fritz died in 2001 at 69, and they couldn't reach any of their family members. But at a 1997 interview, Fritz spoke of the lesson he learned: the inner strength of a single woman who, by her wits and intuition, prevented potential bloodshed, taught me the practical meaning of the words goodwill towards men, or goodwill towards all. And there's a lot of little videos out there about this story. And it's one that kind of signifies hope. Just a couple of last stories. They were talking about soldiers and how they celebrate during the war. There was one that was on an oil tanker in the Pacific during World War II. And he said the officers on this ship, and I'm not going to say it right, the USS Chickamauga, made sure the holiday season was celebrated right. We made a Christmas tree out of stuff the deck crews put together, and we made do with what we had. We sang carols. I can't remember if we had a chaplain, but we had a religious service. And somebody else that was on that ship said that he doesn't remember any trees. We were out in the Pacific, he said. Christmas came and went. Of course, we had a good meal, but that's about it. I believe it was turkey, but it was a Christmas meal, but no Christmas trees, nothing like that. But we might have had services, so they really didn't stick in their memory as well, one would think. And then there were two Jewish men that served on an oil tanker, on that oil tanker, and they were considered lucky because they prayed every morning after strapping tefillin, Tefillin, two small leather cases that contained Hebrew scriptures that Jewish men traditionally wear on the forehead and the left arm during prayer. One day when the ship was under attack and everything was in chaos, the captain came running up and yelled, "Maestrik, have you put on those tefillin yet?" And he spent the war mostly in the US, another gentleman. And for servicemen, it was a chance to either go home or have a good time. If you were near a synagogue, they gave you the day off in religious observance. If you were still stateside in the US, if you were on a ship or in the field, they were careful to have Passover and Yom Kippur. You always get time off for those two major holidays. I was fortunate to be 40 miles east of Los Angeles, and many holidays were open to us. The last thing I'll say, because there are a lot more stories, but Christmas and Hanukkah were pretty minor holidays, believe it or not, at the time, in US history. But all these backgrounds of exchanging gifts, they come from us people and soldiers and people that had come together from other countries. And Christmas tree, I'm going to be honest, it's a pagan symbol. But Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, it wasn't made as such a big deal as it is today. And they think that both gift giving at Christmas and Hanukkah came about because of World War II and sharing those things. It's become a tradition for a lot more people than just children. And it's kind of how gift giving at Hanukkah became much more important, gift giving at Christmas, and it all ties back to World War II. And it's become bigger and bigger, and the period has extended more and more. I thank you so much for joining me. I had a lot of sources. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next month.